Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Gonzii and today we are back with another different type of video. I know it's an animal related video, but it's not casual geographic, no Lindsay Nicole. We do need to check out Lindsay. I've been missing Lindsay's videos, man. But yeah, let's check out Extinct Zoo, one of the best channels out there, and this one is about the most brutal yet bizarre deaths in the fossil record of animals. So without further ado, let's get into this thing, man.
Southwest of Ecuador, there's a fossil site called Tenque Loma that holds one of prehistory's strangest mass graves.
Drink water.
Within its layers lie the remains of thousands upon thousands of bones belonging to giant ground sloths, massive herbivores that once roamed the Americas. But what makes this site particularly bizarre isn't just the sheer number of dead animals, or even the fact that they all died around the same time, it's rather how they died. Because, as paleontologists would eventually discover, these giants met their end in perhaps the most undignified way imaginable, and also one of the most bizarre. And we'll get to that shortly, but what's important to note right now is that this is just one of the many strange deaths throughout Earth's history. And while I do consider myself a bit of a connoisseur in fossilized deaths, having looked at plenty of grim, brutal, and downright unfair victims of life that have been frozen in time thanks to fossilization, what I found myself wondering as of late is what about the less brutal deaths, and the more so, straight up weird, random, and strange ones. Those that make you wonder, how does something like that even happen? And after researching for a bit, I think I found some that represent just about the most bizarre deaths imaginable. And this time we're going to start with a bang, as this first fossil, or fossils, are pretty out there, and it all begins in Ecuador like I mentioned. Here in the Tenque Loma fossil site, you'll find the remains of thousands and thousands of bones that in life had belonged to giant ground sloths, and more specifically, the Remotherium, a herbivorous genus that was an absolute unit, putting all modern sloths to shame and coming in at around 4.5 tons and measuring about 6 meters or 20 feet long, while standing about 3 times the height of a human, overall making it much more comparable to elephants than its modern relatives. And this extended to its skeleton, which was absurdly robust and dense. And so clearly, this would have been a tough cookie. And yet, within Tenque Loma, researchers discovered nearly 24 of these fallen giants that not only had been killed by something, but were done so at around the exact same time, with the team dating the group's demise to be between 18,000 and 23,000 years ago. And at first, it seemed quite obvious what had killed them. As like the La Brea tar pits in the US, this site had a bunch of asphalt, suggesting that the sloths had been quickly buried in sticky death goo, aka tar, that seeped through the marshland area that they were living in. However, what was strange was that the tar only covered a portion of their bodies, not the entirety, whereas in La Brea, most bones are fully submerged. And therefore, this idea that tar had ended them was thrown out the window. And frankly, compared to what's to come, tar would have been the more tame mode of death, as when they kept digging down, they found something a bit weird. An entire layer that surrounded the sloth, which was composed of varying ground plants that were both chewed and digested. More plainly put, this was a complete layer of feces that was large enough to cover a group which combined would have weighed over 80 tons. So we're talking about an Ian Malcolm level of number 2 here. And you'd think this new find would lead to confusion, but for the team, it wasn't confusing at all. Rather, it was the smoking gun that they'd been looking for, as it led to the hypothesis that these giants' deaths had come from their own hands, or rather stomachs, as originally they would have fed on plants in the area, before depositing their leftovers in the pit, which back then was a shallow pool. But slowly over time, these bathroom breaks accumulated, eventually transforming the pool into a toxic waste bucket of despair, where bacteria, parasites, and everything in between ran rampant, ultimately giving the sloths some nasty ailments as they carelessly wallowed and drank the contaminated water, with the pathogens eventually proving too much. Now, this idea may seem like a stretch, but actually, this hypothesis stemmed from a real-life incident where in the 1970s a herd of 140 hippos in Tanzania were observed taking refuge in a shallow pool during a drought, which within a short period, large amounts of waste transformed that little refuge into their doom. And in just a few weeks, the herd ended up losing over 100 members to disease or poisoning. And actually, the soil around the ground sloth's final resting place suggests they ended up in this predicament the exact same way, with a drought forcing them to shelter into an area with food and water. Which is usually good news, but in this case, the cramped space unknowingly doomed the sloths to a fairly unfun and messy end. No pun intended. Yet, not all bizarre deaths have to be unfun. Just ask frogs. Or more specifically, the 45-million-year-old
died because of their own poop. Some ways to go, you know.
Ones that were found within a mass grave in the Geiseltal region of Germany. As of now, we are not too sure what kind of species they were, but we do think they belong to the Pelobatidae family, which lives even today. And in total, hundreds of fossilized frogs were individually identified inside of this graveyard, which back at the time would have been an expansive swamp and a haven for amphibians, which thus begs the question of why did it seemingly kill so many of them? And for a long time, researchers had no clue, and for decades it was actually considered an unsolvable mystery, seeing that all the frogs were seemingly perfectly healthy at the time of death, having no sign of disease, old age, predation, or even scavenging. And so, the only thing paleontologists could go off of was their positioning and numbers, which is obviously not a lot. At first, only one possibility was thought plausible, being that their home had rapidly dried up. Yet if this was the case, they could have easily made for another, given the formation's abundance of swamps, and thus this idea was crossed out. However, a few years ago, after observing living frogs, paleontologists believe they finally have cracked the code to this unsolved dilemma, with the answer essentially being that these frogs got a little too freaky. More specifically, they noticed that among certain extant frogs and toads, that a large source of mortality was mating, as across intense and short breeding seasons, many would often be overcome by exhaustion after or during the deed, and thus leading to them drowning, especially the females who in some groups are often pushed under the water by the dudes. They also realized these Geiseltal frogs,
Nah, man. They went on a Diddy freak off level style. Nah.
likely spent their lives on land, only returning to the swamp to mate, and therefore weren't the best swimmers to begin with, making these fatal freak-offs just that much more common and deadly. But mass amphibian die-offs aren't just a fossil era quirk, as even right now, frogs across the world are teetering on the brink of extinction. But unlike our long-gone frisky friends, these frogs can still be helped, which is why I'm excited to be partnering with my friends at Planet Wild again. And in case you missed my last shout out, Planet Wild is basically crowdfunding for conservation. They choose a new partner every month aimed at protecting animals, forests, and oceans, backed by a community of around 13,000 members whose contributions are used to support these conservation projects. And the best part is that the community gets to see how the contributions are used in monthly videos here on YouTube. So they're 100% transparent about where the funds go. And the projects happen all over the world. For example, they teamed up with a research group in Ecuador to find, breed, and release some endangered frog species before they go extinct for good, which is a very important mission because in case you didn't know, frogs are being wiped out by a fast-spreading fungal pandemic called chytrid. And in Ecuador alone, over 170 species have been completely dropped off the map. And guess what? The mission worked, as they were even able to find a male frog from a species that was thought to be extinct for decades, and was only rediscovered in 2012. And so this is the kind of stuff that honestly you'd expect to be reading about in some scientific journal after it happened. But thanks to Planet Wild, you can literally help fund these projects and see the impact they're having in less than 30 days. And I personally have been a member for quite a while, and I think it's a great way for individuals to get involved in conservation. So if you want to protect Mother Nature, I highly recommend signing up. You can give whatever amount, big or small, as every dollar counts. And I will also cover the first month for the first 100 people that sign up. And if after you don't feel like supporting them anymore, well, you can cancel at any time. So if you want to help save the planet, scan the QR code or click the link in the description. And if you do join, let me know which mission you're most hyped about in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And now, back to the video. Now, with all this said, even though they were having fun, drowning is still not the best way to go. But perhaps the only silver lining to it is that it's not as exceedingly drawn out compared to the death of many other animals, of which includes another prehistoric one, a seriously misfortunate pterosaur, who died in such a rare way that we don't know of any other fossil that represents the same thing. And the pterosaur in question was a Ludodactylus, a fairly large early Cretaceous pterosaur from Brazil. That's a bit interesting in general because it looks almost exactly like what the kid's toy for a pteranodon has become. And another interesting thing about it is the holotype fossil, with the reason being quite evident. Now, it shouldn't take a paleontology degree to tell that something is wrong here, but the specifics are a bit more nuanced. That block you see that has seemingly become a part of the Ludodactylus's jaw is a yucca leaf, of all things, which can actually still be found in various countries today. But this begs the question, how does a leaf end up becoming a part of a pterosaur's body? Well, one may think it was trying to eat it, and then like a sharp Dorito, took it straight to the mouth. Yet, look at those teeth. This guy was obviously no vegetarian. Instead, the paleontologists who discovered this pterosaur reckon that while flying at high speeds, this poor sucker flew straight into a yucca plant. And you know this is terrible news if you've ever encountered this plant before. But for those who haven't, let's just say its leaves aren't nicknamed Adam's needle or the Spanish bayonet for nothing. And actually, some studies have even linked them to an increase in gardening injuries, something that Ludodactylus definitely learned on that fateful day. and the leaf ended up being impaled upon its lower jaw. And this obviously must have been exquisitely painful, and sadly, just the start of its ordeal, as over the next following days, the crippled pterosaur would have slowly withered and died, unable to eat or drink with its disfigured mouth, especially as the wound festered and became infected. And no doubt it tried to dislodge the green spear, yet its efforts proved fruitless, and ended up dying from this injury. And like I said, since its discovery, no other fossil due to death from a leaf is known of,
100%
and maybe that
accurate.
isn't too unexpected.
With the
However,
explosion
as it
well.
turns out, plants and trees as a whole are much more bloodthirsty than you might have expected, and we are aware of other cases where they viciously ended an animal.
Fly took
And included in this very exclusive club was a Cretaceous turtle, of all things, one that had been skewered by a tree. So, not exactly a normal combo. Surprisingly though, this find was really just one part of a larger discovery, as it came from the Tanis fossil site in North Dakota, which is about the only known formation that has preserved animals directly killed by the dinosaur-ending asteroid. And I think that fits the bill for this video perfectly, seeing that actually being ended by an asteroid is pretty rare, bizarre, and at least based off of the fossils, painful. And to drive this point home, you should know that besides the impaled turtle, other notable deaths included a variety of fish, both salt and freshwater based, that were found mangled together miles inland and had gills stuffed full of molten debris. In other words, they had essentially died inhaling lava. And then on top of that, ant nests were found chock full of asteroid debris, a Thescelosaurus was mummified by ejecta, and many groups of non-avian dinosaurs were found smashed to pieces by violent waves. Sadly though, this is just a few of the many fossils that are probably there, as the site is private, and thus a lot of the found fossils have remained hidden from the public. So who knows what else is out there. But that being said, another interesting detail about deaths in these parts is that the victims were often preserved in 3 dimensions, whereas normally fossils are pressed flat. And this is thought to be a result of the violent waves that clumped many of the victims together, turning them basically into canned sardines. And what's really crazy about all of this is that this formation isn't exactly close to ground zero, being located about 3,000 kilometers or 1,900 miles away from the impact site.
Damn.
So think Cairo to Paris approximately. And so, even when being this far, life in the area still endured massive earthquakes, sage waves as tall as 300 feet or 100 meters, a powerful atmospheric blast, and a hail of microtectites, i.e., gravel-sized bodies of natural glass that are formed during meteorite impacts. So this is all to say, this was a very bad day, and one that was ultimately out of the victim's control, which is similar to a situation seen with a very unfortunate rhino, who experienced its own rare and brutal death. But to observe it, we first have to travel to the Turkish region of Cappadocia, a unique place known for a surreal, almost otherworldly landscape, which features a plethora of strange formations. And its construction wasn't the result of visiting aliens, but instead massive volcanic eruptions of 3 ancient volcanoes, which took place millions of years ago, spewing lava all across the lands, and forming its rugged landscape, which has in turn yielded some interesting finds. The most interesting of which, in my opinion at least, was unearthed in 2012, when scientists located a lone Ceratotherium, which is actually the very same genus to which white rhinos belong to. However, this specimen was no creature still on this earth, instead being an extinct species of the genus, who while being a bit smaller than its living counterpart, was by no means a small fry, having weighed over 2 tons in life.
Right, white rhinos are extinct. Yeah, sad one. Sad day. Humans are the worst.
So a real chunkster. And yet, despite its robustness and size, it had been seemingly obliterated, as if it was a bug. The team of paleontologists only found the specimen's head, which was actually remarkably well preserved, but riddled with odd features, including a rough and corrugated surface, while the inside of all of its teeth were exceptionally brittle and corroded, which all pointed to the fact that this rhino was fried, dehydrated, and baked to a crisp all in one. In fact, it was baked so severely that they could only really think of one possibility, given the area, which was that this super unlucky rhino had been caught in a Vesuvius-like eruption that fully engulfed it in a surge of lava exceeding 750 degrees Fahrenheit or 400 degrees Celsius. And so obviously, the pain must have been unimaginable. Yet fortunately, or unfortunately depending on how you view it, it seems that this Ceratotherium didn't have to endure the lava for long, as soon after it was bomb blasted by a pyroclastic flow. In other words, a fast-moving hot avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic rock, which combined with the lava ended up completely dismembering the entire rhino's body, and explaining why, despite being found in pristine condition, only the skull was found. And crazy enough, it turns out that prehistoric rhinos in general had a knack for becoming lavafied, as we do know of another case, this time coming from America, wherein a similar situation took place, but just with one slightly stranger twist. You see, in Washington state, a peculiar cave was discovered about 100 years ago that held a very strange shape, being shallow and then possessing what seemed to be two prongs on the top and a protrusion to the left side. And after investigating it for a while, researchers realized that this odd shape wasn't a coincidence, but rather the result of a mold that formed around an actual animal, a rhino. In this case, likely a Diceratherium, a late Oligocene to Miocene North American genus. Now, it is quite hard to believe that a fossil can be a cave and vice versa, but remnant bones nearby belonging to this beast support the idea, along of course with the aspect that the cave was perfectly shaped like a deceased upside-down rhino. And what's really interesting is that it being upside down was actually a key aspect to figuring out what happened, as this is often what we see in deceased, somewhat large animals that are bloated and floating on water, which is pretty specific. Yet it's this specificity that gave paleontologists their likely story on what occurred to this poor rhino. The presumption is that one day while wallowing in a water source, the rhino was rudely interrupted by a volcanic eruption that sent lava flowing straight towards it. But at the same time, the lava wasn't exactly super fast, and it likely died from the indirect heat and gases before the lava even touched it, which is inarguably even more painful and drawn out demise. But anyways, now dead, the ancient rhino would have started bloating and floating on top of the water, giving it the classic upside down pose. And then, when the lava finally reached the water, and thus the body, it enveloped the rhino in a hot tomb, while the water outside quickly cooled the lava down, forming a natural mold, which was then buried. And then over millions of years, erosion from wind essentially cut the mold in two, exposing it to the world and completing its formation into a full-fledged cave.
Wow.
And so, this obviously sucks for the rhino, but I,
It
for
does.
one, after learning about this specimen, have become a bit hopeful that one day we might discover a dinosaur cave as well. But something tells me the odds of that aren't exactly great.
Nah,
And unfortunately,
sadly, no.
the odds aren't great either when it comes to figuring out another case of exceedingly rare prehistoric deaths. Ones that this time involve a creature not far from home, so to speak, the Australopithecus. And no, I'm not talking about the specimen Lucy, who likely experienced her own unlucky demise, having fallen from a tree, but rather I am talking about AL333, a vast collection of bones and teeth that have become known as the First Family. Located in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, this find was dated all the way back to 3.2 million years ago and contained the remains of possibly over 17 different Australopithecus specimens, who differed in ages, but all came from apparently the same family. And you cannot even begin to imagine just how rare it is to find a group of early hominins that died in the exact same spot and at the exact same time, leading to, unsurprisingly, mass interest in the discovery, and making it by default one of the rarest fossilized deaths we know of. But it's not just what they've found that makes this site rare, but also the nature around their deaths. Because though we aren't sure what exactly happened, the likeliest possibilities are both rare and unusual. Originally, the hypothesis was that the deaths were because of a flash flood, which is actually quite common as far as mass deaths go. Yet tests on the sediments around the area largely discredit this idea, and therefore a new idea was put forth, one that hypothesized a much more grim and unique possibility, which was that this site was the location of a one-of-a-kind massacre, one that was carried out not by other hominins, but literal man-eaters. The question is, though, which one? And given the sheer amount of hominins that died, we're pretty confident it had to be a pack hunter, leading to giant ancient hyenas being a prime suspect. But the problem with that idea is that they are vicious bone munchers who happen to leave very little in evidence behind. And thus, the focus was shifted to other potential suspects, chiefly large felines, who are known to both hunt in packs and surplus kill, meaning that they hunt for more food than they can actually eat. And this further checks out when you realize that these guys avoid bones when they can, but will often still get a calcium boost here and there through the odd bone slipping down their throats. And these odd bones are typically bones from the fingers or toes, which coincidentally were missing in mass in AL333, leading to the assumption that if predators were the killers, that it truly was felines, with the prime suspects thought to be saber-toothed cats, such as the Homotherium, Meganterion, or Dinofelis. Of course, though, not everyone is on board with this hypothesis, with questions remaining on just how a predator, or even predators, would have killed over a dozen Australopithecus in one go, especially when we consider the fact that we aren't sure if these saber-toothed cats in particular lived in packs or not. And that's why we also have the second, less bloody, but in some ways equally messy hypothesis, which is that this family just had some really bad dinner, eating something that caused food poisoning so severe that within a short window, they were all dead. And while it's not unheard of for food poisoning to kill large amounts of animals in a short time, some researchers do find it a stretch considering their vegetarian diets, and the fact they all pretty much died in the exact same spot. And so alas, in the end, this strange case remains shrouded in mystery. And it is not the only one, as there is an additional bizarre case that was for a while a complete mystery too, involving fossils that consisted not of one, but two separate animals, the Jurassic fish Tharsis and its contemporary, belemnites, a kind of cephalopod. And they, starting a few years back, began to show up together within the same fossil, in a rather unique pose that looked just like this. And if you've been following, you might notice similarity to the pterosaur leaf incident, so it might be clear what's going on here. But if you need a hint, what you're looking at is two animals fused together, not shoulder to shoulder, with that belemnite being inside of that fish. And it's not just this fossil, because the really strange part here is that multiple fossils almost identical to this one have been found, leading to the understandable confusion and questions of what the heck was going on during the Jurassic. I mean, the Jurassic is already known for being crazy, but to find multiple specimens of animals impaled within one another is still a slightly far out there story, and one without many leads. But the obvious first step to figuring out what happened is to identify which one was impaling the other. But even that proved hard, because the belemnite for one would almost certainly never try to take on a fish that size. And while they did have hard internal shells that could technically pierce things at high speeds, their kind wasn't exactly known to utilize them for ramming. And meanwhile the fish, the Tharsis, was larger in size, but was a known microcarnivore, feasting on decaying soft tissue or overgrowth, and thus definitely not hunting down squids half their length. And so, unsurprisingly, some detective work was needed to get to the bottom of this. And literally only a few weeks ago, a breakthrough was actually made, after paleontologists realized something peculiar with all of the involved cephalopods, which was that they had a bunch of bivalves growing on them, a sign that perhaps they had been dead all along, even prior to the impalement, which in turn led to the hypothesis that the belemnites, deceased and full of little animals, had started to float towards the surface, a result of their internal shells filling with gas. And once at the surface, researchers believe they became deceitful, fatal traps for the Tharsis, as it had a tendency to suck on floating objects. Now, normally size difference between fish and objects, or an object's shape, would prevent catastrophe. But in this specific scenario, the unusual size of the fish and the highly aerodynamic design of the belemnites made for a surprisingly common predicament wherein the cephalopod's rostrum would slip straight through the Tharsis's mouth and into their gills. Not a pretty sight. And once in, the fish was unable to dislodge the makeshift spear and would slowly suffocate until death finally befell them. So there you have it, a collection of some of the most bizarre deaths preserved in the fossil record. From giant ground sloths literally drowning in their own waste, to frogs dying from doing too much hanky-panky. And what's perhaps the craziest thing about all of this is that these are just the deaths we managed to find and figure out. For every bizarre fossil death we discover, there are millions more that we'll never know about, either because they didn't fossilize well, or because we haven't stumbled upon them yet. And ultimately, these fossils serve as more than just curiosities or morbid entertainment. They're windows into the past that show us that life has always been unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and often just plain weird. It's a reminder that despite all of our technology and knowledge, we're still at the mercy of chance, bad timing, and Mother Nature. And if nothing else, they prove that no matter how tough you think you are, whether you're a 4-ton ground sloth or a flying reptile with a 13-foot wingspan, nature and pure dumb luck will always find a way to humble you. So the next time you're having a bad day, just remember, at least you're not a Jurassic fish with a dead squid stuck in your gills. Thanks for watching, and until next time, on Extinct Zoo.
So there you have it, man. Phenomenal video by Extinct Zoo. One of my favorite channels to watch, man. And it's just bizarre. The whole fossil thing, it's incredible. Because it can only fossilize in certain conditions. So there's like tons and tons and tons of animals that they existed that we'll never know existed because they didn't fossilize. And that's insane to think about. But yeah, guys, once again, thank you so much for watching the video, man. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. All glory to Jesus Christ. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.